topic of today is inflation. But before we get started, just a little bit of warm up for us. Today is March 31st. I think we came to the observation that every single day of the year has a number of ridiculous holidays associated with it. Yep. Today actually has a cool one. It is National Manatee Appreciation Day, which is these are the most awesome animals, aren't they? Some crazy woman in Florida years ago got in trouble because she tried to ride one, which was definitely no-no. So I think she got jail time, thank God. So appreciate the manatees around you if you got one. And it's also on the food theme. It is National Clams on the Half Shell Day as well. And maybe it needs a holiday because I have a question for all of you. While we're thinking about clams and shellfish, we're going to look at data from flavor outside of shrimp and various versions of shrimp. What do you all think is the most popular shellfish in America? And this means the thing that the most number of consumers love or like. We're looking at our flavor data here. So in chat, what do you think is the most popular shellfish in America other than shrimp?
Seeing a lot of crab and a lot of lobster.
Anything else?
Let me see. Oysters, scallop. A lot of people are starting scallops and mussels.
What do you think, Mark?
I would think crab.
So let's see. Well, I think this is a smart group. So all the stuff at the top, we're going to look at this column over here in the data, which is percentage of people that love or like that thing. We're looking in the shellfish category right now. Yeah, like the top spots are all basically variations of shrimp. And then it's crab, and then lobster right behind it, then a whole bunch more shrimp. Then you have snow crab, which I guess sort of fits in that crab thing, and then comes scallops. So actually, then I think the folks here sort of nailed it pretty well. But It is interesting how fast things start to drop off from there. That you start, in the high 60s or 70s, and when you get a little bit further down the list, you're sort of into the 30s. Clam is all the way down at 37%, barely ahead of soft shell crab. So it is National Clams on the Half Shell Day. Clams need a little bit of love. I think.
Where's crab cake? Crab cake needs a lot of love. I
think that would be in our appetizer probably section.
Okay, gotcha.
Right. So these are like the sort of like the thing itself. But yeah, if you're at a restaurant today and they have clams, you should probably get some clams and show clams a little bit of love. Because when we look at clam, you could see that this is, again, percentage of people that love and how much people love it. And we have it indexed over here. It's like higher among boomers. It's higher in the Northeast, obviously, but the boomer spike is telling you because really boomers like clams a lot, and it drops off substantially from there. And with that in mind, it's probably not a big surprise that clams have been declining precipitously on restaurant menus for a good decade now. So if you have a historic love for clams, today is the day to show your love for clams and help get this number back up if you feel so inclined to do so.
Someone in the audience is making the point that supply chain with clams is horrendous right now.
Is it really? Well, the question is, has it been for the last 10 years that we've seen decline as well? So yeah, maybe today is maybe it's particularly bad today. And you can see like clams are used. This is the percentage of all clam uses on menus that fall into various categories. Sort of skews into some areas like pasta and then obviously like clam chowder and whatnot. But I don't know, like only 0.7%, less than 1% of all clams on menus are in a hot sandwich. I could probably do some more clam sandwich stuff. So
like a po' boy?
Yeah, I would hope so. But it looks like we're not doing so much of that right now. So let's show some clams some love. Okay, let us get started with the real topic at hand today, which is all about inflation. Please, everyone, if you have not already yet, hit that chat button. Let us know where you're chatting in from, and please share with all of your friends from around the industry what the most expensive gas you have seen personally in your own city has been. It looks like we have a pretty good range of responses, and it's pretty good at, tells you where you might want to move if you want to stretch your dollar a bit further as well. But you're among hundreds of peers in the food industry. Say hi to them all and let us know what city you're in and what's the most expensive gas you've seen so far. As a reminder, many of you are using our Report Pro service already, which is great, and we got some brand new content in there for you. You should definitely check out next time you're in. We have a wonderful episode of Food Bites that sort of does a retrospective of what COVID has been and what it looks like sort of going forward as well, sort of like the all-in-one summary of our experiences as a food industry through COVID. We have a really fun one around cryptocurrency and NFTs, and you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with food? Well, you're seeing things like restaurant brands start to engage in this, right? We did a topic on the metaverse as well, and you have, brands that are jumping with that. I think I just saw a headline today that Wendy's is doing like the Wendyverse or something in conjunction with Meta. But this one's on cryptos and NFTs. Again, you'll find that inside of Report Pro. And we have an entire series of what we call pulse reports, which look individually, one at a time, at all the different segments in food service, whether it's fast casual or hospitals and healthcare or K through 12 schools. A look at operators in those segments and what they care about and what challenges they're facing, and what you as either a partner or supplier to those segments should be doing to really get their attention and help them out. So that's our Pulse series. You'll find that inside of Report Pro as well, along with over 1,000 other reports, with new reports being published every single week. So that takes us to our main topic of today, which is inflation. And we're going to feature some data from a few different sources today, both internal Datassential data. We're going to look at some of our menu data. We're going to look at some of our new consumer and operator survey data. And we're also going to look at some government statistics as well. So here's a question for all of you. This is a question that we asked to consumers very, very recently, which is, are you seeing signs of inflation and rising prices in the general economy? Use chat. And what percentage of US consumers do you think answered yes to this question? Pick a number. Number between 0 and 100. What percentage of consumers said yes to this?
Lots of guesses, very, very, very high.
What's the range we're seeing?
I would say probably the lowest is going to be 80%, highest is 100%. And a couple people have gotten it exactly.
So we're guessing tremendously high, and yeah, it is tremendously high. Like 96%, I think, might just about be the highest number I've ever seen responding to a survey question, pretty much ever.
Yeah,
right?
I laughed for a solid minute when we got this out of the field. The first time we asked was back in May, and I thought, well, I was surprised even back in May of 2021 when it was 80%, because I thought, I bet you only news junkies care about that and notice it. But a lot of people back then, and basically everybody now. 90s, effectively 100% at this point when you factor in things like margin of error or whatnot. So it's impacting or at least being noticed by essentially everyone in this economy. And here's just what that historic inflation number looks like. This is year-over-year inflation by month going back to the 60s, and you see the big spikes we had in the 70s, and we're sitting at about 7.9%. And I think new inflation data releases, it's either next Thursday or the Thursday after. I think it's probably next Thursday they'll release the March data, so we'll see which direction that moves in. But another inflationary measure was released today, and it came in, pretty high, historically high. I think 1/10 of a percentage point under expectations, but expectations were quite high in the first place. So you can see that we are definitely at a high point, at least in recent memory. And if you look at where the US is, this is February 2022 inflation numbers year over year, let's say, versus the rest of the world. The other numbers you'll see here are also February 2022 numbers. In some cases, some countries don't have more recent data yet, so they'll either be from the month before in January, or they could be as far back as December 2021. But essentially, it's an apples to apples comparison, right? So Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, Russia are higher. Other countries tend to be lower than where the US currently is. So certainly there are signs of global inflation, but the US is pretty high in the greater scheme of things, both compared to other countries and where we have been ourselves historically.
So Mark, I know you asked folks, how long they think this inflationary period is going to last. What do they tell us?
Well, I mean, when we asked this a few months ago, people were a little bit more optimistic that it might be passing. But now I think that a lot of folks are really, really in for the long haul. A majority of folks are saying, at least through the end of this year. Fewer people are saying permanently than last time, which is a relief there. But basically, everybody is kind of girding for another 12 plus months of prices rising pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people in December that thought this could be over by the first quarter of this year.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so this is not us asking people, so we asked, sorry to clarify, we asked once, we asked in December of 2021, and we asked again in March of 2022. And we've asked these types of questions in the past, but we're just comparing the December of 2021 and the March of 2022 numbers. So these periods are pretty close together. In December of 2021, you had a whole bunch of people, about 18%, that figured this whole inflationary period would be done by the first quarter of 2022. That's been essentially eradicated. And you see a reduction in people that say that this is going to be done by the second quarter of 2022 as well. So it seems like a lot of folks, if they're not just sort of projecting out like a few months saying, oh, this is a 3-month problem. A lot of those people that used to think this was a short-term problem have now come to recognize, or at least believe, that this is probably more of a long-term problem than they previously thought. I mean, you could see big jumps, right? The percentage of people that say this is going to go to 2023 or longer is up 18 points versus just sentiment a couple of months, 3 months ago in December, right? There's very few people thinking this is going to be short-term at this point. But as Mark said, you have actually a couple less people that think this is going to be a permanent condition, which is good. So, so that's the outlook. So you got to almost think like, if that is the mindset that consumers have, it would make sense for them to start adjusting some of their behavior in anticipation of that, right? You're going to act differently if you think something's going to be over in a couple of months or a couple of weeks than if you think it's going to be a little bit more systemic. So what do we see in terms of the types of behavioral changes that consumers would engage in if inflation sustained at a high level?
Yeah, from the period 3 months before to more recently, the rank order of things that people kind of would look to save some money in their budgets hasn't really changed that much. But unfortunately for our industry, dining out is kind of one of the places where people think, well, we'll see in a few slides that it's not necessarily that they think food at home is cheaper. It's just that, you can cut back on, those occasions where you dine out and have food away from home. And one thing here that strikes me about this chart is that it's not just dining out and restaurant meals, but it's also a lot of the occasions, excuse me, a lot of the occasions that go with it. If you are traveling, if you are, going out to see a show or something, those usually, have a restaurant visit attached to them. And you usually have to, fill your gas tank to get there if you're traveling for a night out. And a lot of those categories are where people are really going to be cutting back. Some things, alcoholic beverages just hasn't really been, up there on the list, and neither really has trying to find more affordable housing, because that's just its own challenge in its own right. But, one fewer or two fewer restaurant visits when you can stay home and make a PBJ, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even back in December, not only was restaurants the one place where people said they would most cut back in, if inflation persists, that number has actually grown in the last 3 months. And the distance between it and number 2 has actually grown as well. Now, it is interesting that you see relative decreases in anticipated cutbacks in things like grooming and alcoholic beverages and housing and even e-commerce. But I think we've seen in the past that things like discretionary income or disposable income tend to correlate quite highly with restaurant visitation. So we're going to take a look at what this sort of means for consumers' budgets and maybe what the industry should be doing about this as well. Gas prices have obviously been a headline. So what was the most expensive gas we saw among the chat today? Did we see anything break $6? It had to have,
in the
right?
chat, I saw Southern California break $6. Someone said Orange County, someone said San Diego above $6.
Yeah, so this is the mobile station across from the Beverly Center in LA, sort of like in that West Hollywood area. It's like long been known for being some of the most expensive gas in Southern California, which I think makes it some of the most expensive gas in the country. But I saw a thing where in Mendocino, there was one gas station that reached for premium, I think $8.93 a gallon.
Oof.
That is gnarly. Imagine $200 to fill up your tank. That is just pretty crazy. And you can sort of see this is the price of retail gasoline over time, and where we are today, it is at a pretty considerable high. And maybe the best way of actually looking at this is we're going to break this same chart out a little bit differently. We're going to have a line for each of the last few years and show you what the trends look like for each day of each month throughout the year. So we were already at a high, let's say pre-Russia/Ukraine, our pink line over there in 2022. And of course, it has only since spiked dramatically from there. So the pain has been here for a little bit, but it's even more acute today. And the question is, well, what does that actually mean for people? Well, we asked, right, Mark? We asked, is gas taking up more of your budget? And what did people tell us?
Well, I mean, 3/4 of us are paying more. Some of us are paying significantly more, and just the complete vertical rise in the charts of the prices we just saw bear that out. There are very, very few respondents who told us that they just don't drive anyway. They don't drive their own car. So everybody is kind of affected by this and has to, adjust to higher prices. What we can't totally see in these responses to the way that this question was worded was, how many people are trying to, drive less, shorter distances. This is just how much they are paying more per month. So even the folks that are paying, a lot more per gallon are probably trying to cut back the distance they've driven where they can.
Yeah, and the question is, how inelastic is gas? Like, is it a fixed thing where you got to get it no matter what, or at some point when it gets expensive enough, do you actually change your behavior in a material way? But the fact that it's eating up more of people's budgets, and oftentimes significantly more, means that even in the wake of higher gas prices, consumers are either not able to or not willing to adjust consumption enough that it's a net neutral effect on their budget, or they could actually decrease their gas expenditures. So they're spending more, right? They're spending more on gas, which means there's a little bit less money available for everything else. And here's some basic math. So I think this might be a AAA number at the top or a Kelley Blue Book number. Well, one of those automobile associations says that the typical car gets driven, 14,263 miles per year and gets 24 miles to the gallon. So 14,263 divided by 24 is like 594, let's say. 594 gallons times an extra $2 per gallon on average that people are paying right now, which works out to about $1,200 a year more spent on gas than you would have had to spend before the gas price hikes that we have. That's a big chunk of change, right? I think the median US savings amount, not average, median, right? If you do average, like the numbers get skewed by like the crazy billionaires that have giant bank accounts out there, but the median US savings, I think, is something like $5,500 or $5,300 or something like that. Like $1,200 is a pretty significant hit to that. And when you put on top of that, like the exploding costs in rent, and I know this is just like a new rent statistic, so it's not really representative of everything, but I think among new rents, like here in Florida, there's a town called Palm Beach Gardens, maybe like 40 minutes from where I live. I think they said in the last year, rents increased 52%. That's crazy, right? I mean, so these are big potential hits to people in some categories where you just cannot be elastic with your spending, right? Sometimes you just have to have gas and you have to have a place to live.
That works out to, $100 a month extra that you have to put into the gas tank. I mean, for most people, from 2021 to 2022, if you were fortunate enough to get a raise at your job, I mean, that probably more than eats all of what you're gaining in your paycheck.
Yeah, it's a big thing, right? And that's a lot of not just consumers, but specifically consumers of food products as well. So you could see energy costs almost across the board are up. Even electricity is more expensive today than it was a year ago. And some of these are really big jumps, like 30-40% increases in various types of energy over the course of a year. So energy is a big component of the increase in CPI that we've seen, and sort of that headline inflation rate of 7.9%. But there are other contributors to this as well. So this is Bureau of Labor Statistics data that shows you for the month of February 2022 versus a year ago, February 2021, what was the inflation rate for various categories of products. And we're not showing every single category over here because there's a lot of them. We're just sort of showing you some of the extremes and some of the stuff in the middle. So any guesses as to what are some of the things that grew most in cost versus a year ago?
People are saying food, a lot of food. People are saying meat and housing.
Okay, well, so let's hit the button and we'll see. So this is one I think many people have heard about. Used cars, number one, 41% higher than a year ago. So if you're thinking about selling your used car, that's a really good time to sell that used car. And there's actually a weird phenomenon going right now where a lot of new cars have waiting lists, basically. So if you can find a place that'll sell you a waitlisted car and they'll sell it to you for sticker, you might be even sell your used car for more than you paid for it a few years ago. So that's
I get offers all the time for my minivan with 140,000 miles on it. Like they want to give me, they want to give me a good price for it.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then you can see away from home lodging is up 25%. Some of that might be not just a lot of that might be demand based as well. And then car and truck rentals are up significantly. How about on the other side, right? Some of the things that are decreasing, it's mostly technology items. Smartphones have come down on average about 13% in price. Consumer information technology, different types of devices down about 8%. Video discs, which is I think their way of basically saying things like DVDs, those are down as well. I mean, they had things called video discs back in like the 80s and 90s, but that format sort of went away. Here, I think it means DVDs and whatnot.
Yeah. I bet typewriters are down too.
Yeah, and right here, smack dab in the middle, well, not in the middle of the chart, but in the middle of the vertical area, is food at about 7.9%, which is right on target with inflation overall. So food is up food as a whole is up 7.9%, as is all sort of goods and service tracked in the CPI number. So, I mean, you can see most of those things were up. Food is up fairly dramatically. This is probably one of our only poll questions today. I'm actually just sort of curious, for those of you that are that actually sell food items, so not if you're a services company, but if you're actually to sell food items, has your company taken a larger than normal price increase on its products within the past several months? Or have you not done it yet, but you think you will do so in the months ahead? Or have you not taken a larger than normal price increase and do not expect that you will be doing so in the foreseeable future? So I actually do not know how people would answer to this. Have the price increases already started to happen, or is there going to be a wave of price increases that hadn't taken place yet that are coming through? So we have a whole lot of responses. I'm going to give another 20 seconds, then we'll share this out. But I will say that the answers are fairly dramatic. If you had a guess, Mark, what percentage of people are saying, no, we have not yet taken a larger than normal price increase, and we don't really expect to be doing so in the months ahead? How many people do you think answered option C, or what percent?
Infinitesimally small. I'm going to say 5%.
You know, I don't even know why we need to do these polls anymore. Like, can I just ask you? Because you nailed it. But it's the 5% here, I think, mirrors like the 4% of consumers that haven't noticed higher prices in the general as well.
Or they just clicked the wrong thing. They misclicked.
Yeah, but this is actually interesting. So 4 out of 5 of us have already done the price increase. And for those of us that haven't already, 3 out of 4, 16% out of the remaining 21, think that you'll be doing so in the months ahead. So prices are certainly higher and will probably be continuing to increase for restaurants and other buyers of food. Okay.
And unfortunately, there's probably a lot of A and B going on.
Yeah. So I figured we could play our version of The Price is Right and see how individually or collectively smart we all are about the price of things and what's gone up in price or what's gone down in price. So in chat, what do you think grew more in price over the last year? Furniture and bedding or wine at home? What has seen the larger price, percentage price increase?
I think everybody's guessing the right thing here, it looks like.
What are they guessing?
They're all guessing furniture.
Yeah, furniture up 17%, wine only 2%. Yeah. Okay, let's try another one. How about dental services or women's dresses?
Okay. It's roughly breaking down 50-50. People are saying both here.
Yeah, dental service, I'm okay, maybe there's like labor shortage. Women's dresses, maybe there's supply chain or stuff being stuck on a container ship or something. But the answer is women's dresses. Dental services haven't really moved very much in price. And one last one, pet food or admission to sporting events.
A lot of mostly pet food.
I think pet food has increased more in price, more so than sporting events. Is that right?
Yeah, mostly people are saying pet food.
So actually it's sporting events by a pretty wide margin. So, you know, I think pet food is pretty expensive. And sometimes I'm like, boy, when I look at the portion size, it's almost as expensive or more than like the people food that I eat.
Yeah.
But at least the inflation on pet food hasn't been so bad yet, I guess. So, okay. So I think we did okay at The Price is Right. You'll see that the level of inflation that's observed does change depending on the part of the country that we're in, right? I think we saw from, you know, gas prices are really big in Southern California, but if you look at everything that's swept under that umbrella of CPI, here's what it looks like. So the bottom section of the chart is inflation from 2021 versus 2020. And then the pink area is, you know, 2022 versus 2021 for the February period, going a year back and then another year back. And the number at the top in white is what the 2-year inflation rate looks like. And there is some travel, right? It's not, you know, 7% everywhere or 8% everywhere. It's a little bit lower in some markets than in others. Do you like notice anything in just sort of like the rank order of these things? You know, you look at the markets where there have been more inflation versus the ones where there have been less. Does anything sort of stand out?
My guess at first was, if you look at so Tampa, Miami, those are cities in Florida, Atlanta and Phoenix. I feel like these are kind of the Sun Belt cities that are gaining population. And so my thought was maybe that's putting pressure on housing.
I think you're right. It's where are people going versus where are people leaving in large part.
Yeah.
And another way of thinking about this is looking at something like population change. So in terms of sheer numbers, here are the counties in the US, and the Census Department just released this data, I think, last week. This is sort of, I think, what's the period? Do we say what the period is over here? Yeah, April or July 2020 versus July of 2021, basically 1 year change in the midst of COVID. The counties that lost the most number of people versus the counties, well, let's actually look at the ones that lost the most people, right? It's like California, it's New York, and interestingly, Miami-Dade County right? Sort of Miami, for Miami's sake, actually had a net loss in population. Now, other parts of Florida, and I think if you go a little bit further north to Palm Beach County or central and northern Florida, you see a lot more population growth. But Miami did lock down pretty significantly. I think in some of the foot traffic data we've seen, Miami's been a little bit slower to recover there as well. But you can see the types of places where people tended to be leaving versus where we saw increases in population, Arizona, Texas. Interestingly, in California, Riverside County specifically, which is obviously going to be less expensive than most of LA County is, but Arizona, Texas, Florida dominates. And if you actually looked at these numbers, not by hard number of population increase, but you looked at like percentage change, and you sort of looked at the things that grew the most on a percentage basis, you'd have stuff like, I think Boise, St. George, Utah, some of those types of places would be represented at the top. So it does start to feel like some of the places where people are going have had more inflation, which just sort of makes sense from a supply and demand perspective. The other thing that we could look at is unemployment data as well. So this is January 2022 versus January 2020, basically 2-year change in unemployment in different parts of the country. So if you are at the left-hand side of this chart, this is a place where unemployment has increased since pre-COVID times. And if you're on the right-hand side of the chart, this is places where unemployment has actually decreased. San Juan, in case you're interested, I think is actually Puerto Rico in this case, because you're like, what is that? What's that doing over here? And you can look at sort of the cities, but what we thought was sort of interesting is, what if you overlaid this and you did a chart where you showed on one axis the unemployment change, basically the numbers that we just saw by city, that's going along your x-axis at the bottom, and on the y-axis going from bottom to top, the inflation rate over the last couple of years. And the question is, do you see any sort of a pattern or correlation between the two? And at least if you eyeball this, I mean, it really does look like there is sort of a downward sloping line over here, that as unemployment, as the change in unemployment increases, the impact of inflation tends to be lower. And it just makes sense, right? If you have more employed people, you're gonna have more people buying stuff, and that puts more pressure on prices. So inflation, as you would expect, would be higher. So we should know that this is not a uniformly national issue. This is something that tends to be specific in certain parts of the country more so than others. Even as we saw with gas prices, they're sort of all over the board. But here we have directional pressures that are specific to certain parts of the country as well. So if you're, let's say, from a restaurant chain with national pricing, let's say, maybe you consider saying, yeah, some parts, we're seeing more price pressure in some parts of the country than others. And maybe you think about things a little bit differently as a result. So basically, if place has been growing in population, and if it's been doing well on an employment basis, that's where inflation tends to be highest. Now, we said that the inflation rate for food is the same as for all items as a whole, but how does that break up between food at home and food away from home? So this is still Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and we're going to get in some of our own menu data very, very shortly. But you can see that food at home tended to have larger increases than food away from home. So this is primarily a grocery store phenomenon, but it certainly doesn't mean that restaurant food hasn't gotten more expensive as well. So if you look at the range of food categories that exist, so stuff that you could buy in a grocery store, let's say, there is a pretty broad range in how much inflation we've seen in those categories, right? It's definitely not uniform. You have some categories that are up in the high teens, and others where they've barely moved in price over the last year. So I would like you all to maybe take a guess. What are some of the categories in food and beverage that have had the smallest degree of inflation Let's start with that, and then we'll have you guess which ones have had the most inflation. So what belongs in next to the blue boxes, basically on the left? Which food categories that you might find at the store have had the least amount of inflation? I know some of this is like just, how things are categorized and whatnot, but just throw your ideas out there and you'll get full credit if you're directionally close to the categorization. What type of things are we seeing, Mark?
A lot of people are saying alcohol and other beverages having the lowest inflation. And then some are saying produce and baby food, but the most popular guess is going to be beverages having
so that's interesting. And if you could maybe say in chat, are people arriving in that based on personal observation from going to the store, or because they know that because they operate in those categories?
I don't know. People are saying personal observations and being in the store.
Yeah. So I think we have very astute shoppers there, because if you look at some of the stuff that has sort of least increased in price, here's some of them right here. A lot of it is, like you said, it's beverage, and it is produce in many cases. You have a little bit of, shelf-stable fish is a pretty specific category. Sure. I think that means like canned tuna and that type of thing. But there you haven't had much. Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. What belongs on the right-hand side of this chart next to the pink boxes? What has increased the most?
People are saying all manner of proteins and meats, avocados. Some are saying dairy as well.
Yeah. So again, really good guesses. You look at this list and it is basically dominated by protein categories, right? Beef and veal, bacon, beef roast, beef steaks, various pork products, fresh and frozen chicken parts. And that's what consumers are facing. And when we ask people, hey, where are you, as it relates to food, whether you're getting food at the store or getting it from a restaurant, where are you sort of noticing the most sticker shock? Like, where have you noticed prices either being higher or lower than they seemed to be 6 months ago? And it really does seem to be that it's being most noticed in places like supermarkets, more so than restaurants. Now, of course, a preponderance of people say like restaurant food's certainly gotten more expensive than it has gotten cheaper. But if you rank order where people have most noticed this and sticker shock has sort of been most prevalent, it tends to be at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. So depending on which side of the business you're on, there's various things that you could maybe do with that in terms of your messaging, right? We know that restaurant visitation is an area of potential cutbacks because it's viewed as a bit more as a luxury or a treat in many cases, but people are actually noticing higher prices more often at the grocery store. So you can sort of take that in a couple of different directions depending on what type of business you are and how you want to construct that message. You do have some play. So I thought we could transition then into a look at what's actually happening on restaurant menus and what that means. So I think probably the majority of you use our menu trends service, which looks at how menus evolve and change over time and what we think future forecasts of flavors and whatnot may be. One thing that we've done recently is we've started updating that data more frequently. That menu trends now undergoes a quarterly update, so we get to look at information faster and more often than ever before. And one interesting use of this is to just understand what's happening with menu pricing. So we're going to look at data that runs through Q4 of 2021 on the menu. And we wanted to understand how much menu prices rose. So here's the question for you all. So if you look at Q4 2021 versus Q4 2020, in the general economy for all items that you'd consider to be part of CPI, that inflation rate was 7%. Right, so Q4 2020 versus Q4 2021. During the same period, Q4 2020 versus Q4 2021, how much did menu prices go up? If all prices for all products, that you could buy, all goods and services went up by 7% in that period, how much did menu prices increase during that same period of time?
Yeah, our audience is mostly guessing lower than total U.S. inflation. So, if we saw a few minutes ago that food inflation was 7.9%,
Yep.
Right in line with total inflation, people are thinking that restaurant menus are probably under that a little bit.
Yeah, very, very smart. And I feel like, did we give away the answer by showing that other stat first about comparing food away from home versus total?
Yeah,
Or was
I
it
don't
a
know.
very smart, a very smart audience? You're right. The number is 5.7%, so not quite fully that 7%. A little bit, just a little bit further back, right? There's about a 1.3% gap. But we want to break this out a little bit further and understand the real dynamics behind how menu prices actually change and what this might mean for the future. The first thing to look at is how this is different from one restaurant segment to the next. Limited service restaurants tend to have experienced on a percentage basis, a greater degree of menu price inflation than full service restaurants have. You can see that fine dining had the lowest level of 1 year inflation at 4%, and QSRs and fast casuals are at about almost 7%, 6.6%. Mid-scale and casual fall somewhere in between. The other thing to think about, right, if we look at those numbers, right, this is that menu inflation number we just saw, 6.6% for QSR and fast casual, 4% for fine dining. There are a few different components to this, and the components in some cases are almost as interesting or as informative as the final 6.6% number, right? And here are the components. Number one is, what percentage of all menu items in that segment actually experienced a price increase? On the whole, prices in QSR are 6.6% higher, but for every 100 items on a QSR menu, how many actually saw a price bump? And here's how it looks by segment. You could see that QSRs and fast casual saw more of their menu experience a price increase. Roughly, 50% of their menu saw an increase in price. Whereas fine dining, only about 1 in 5 items saw an increase in price during that time. A pretty big discrepancy. And then the second question is, okay, well now, if an item increased in price, how much did it increase in price? And this is that third column, right? What is the amount of price change among just the items that actually saw an increase? And this is really interesting, where you don't see as much discrimination between segments. Like, the numbers are all pretty consistent here, sort of in that 15, 16% range. Mm-hmm. So I see a couple of things over here. So it seems like, number one, the primary decisions that restaurants have been making is not so much around discriminating between how much they increase the price of an item, it's whether or not that item gets an increase, right? That's where you see more differences between the segments. And if there is an increase, it's actually a fairly substantial increase, mm-hmm. right? So if you're used to going in and getting those same, 3 dishes or something at your favorite restaurant, if they happen to be 3 dishes where the price went up, your check is now 15, 16% more expensive. It's not 5 or 6% more expensive. It's 15, 16% more expensive. And if you happen to like the items that did not experience a price increase, then you're paying the same or maybe even less in some cases. So there could be dramatically different experiences depending on the particular consumer and what dishes they tend to go back for. But that's the number one lesson, is that there's that limited service restaurants increased price more than full service restaurants, and that the price increase decision tended to be made more along the lines of what was the dish versus how much do we increase price on a percentage basis. Mm-hmm. If we look at that same notion of menu inflation, percentage of items that increase in price, and how much those items actually changed in price if there was a price increase, and you look at this by urban versus suburban or rural areas, I was frankly pretty surprised. I thought we'd see differences here. You don't. For all intents and purposes, these numbers are basically all the same. They're mildly different by, a tenth of a percentage point or 0.2 of a percentage point, but they're all pretty much the same. I would have expected that urban would have seen the least inflation and suburban and rural would have seen more inflation, and following with the theme of, hey, where are people moving to? But that ended up actually not being the case. So it's not so much about the type of geography, it's more about the type of restaurant, the segment that it falls in. How about parts of the menu, like different areas on the menu? Here it gets pretty interesting again, right? So the first key column is that first one that says, what was the total menu inflation in that part of the menu? And you see some variations over here, right? You can see that adult beverages had the least amount of change, whereas, categories like entrees and appetizers and sides in total saw more of a change. But what's really, really interesting is how we arrived at that total menu inflation. Entrees are substantially more likely to have increased in price than are sides or desserts or beverages or adult beverages. Over 1/2 of all entrees saw a price adjustment, right? Which is much higher than the rates of price adjustment we see for sides, desserts, and beverages and adult beverages. Appetizers are just a little bit further behind. Now, I think what you'll find is this is largely because a lot of those entree categories are protein heavy, and that's where we've seen increases in price to the operator. And they say, yeah, I just can't stay at this price point anymore. I have to do something, or my food costs and my profit margin just isn't where I need it to be. What's interesting, though, is in the area of, let's say, sides and to a lesser extent, desserts, when there is an increase, it tends to be an outsized increase. Like if a side dish got more expensive, it usually got a lot more expensive to the tune of 23%, which is significant. Now, again, sides are going to be less expensive items on the menu, so it might be like $1 increase, and it just ends up being a lot more on a percentage basis. But that's the reality of how prices have changed by menu part.
And I wonder if there's some pricing strategy going on too, where if a side a la carte is going up in price a lot, I wonder if that would be driving people more toward sort of combo meals or stuff like that among the mid-service restaurants.
It's certainly possible, and we're going to talk about, I think, the implications and how I think we should be thinking about this as an industry going forward, because I don't think many of us think that inflation is ending anytime soon. So what do we do about it? But we wanted to show here a little discrimination between how much menu prices increased overall in each one of these categories on a dollar basis. And also, if you look at just items that saw an increase, how much they went up in price. So the green item, the green block is total menu inflation on a dollar basis for that category. And the pink ones is just among items that actually saw a price increase, how much was that increase? So the thing that strikes me is, yes, everything's a little bit more expensive, but the pink thing, it's actually pretty big number, right? Like it's at a level that should be noticeable to a lot of consumers. If you go back and all of a sudden something's $2 more for that dish than you remember it being, you'll probably notice that, right? Like you probably don't notice that on average, all the entrees are 91 cents more expensive. Maybe that falls underneath the threshold, but at $2, you might start to notice it. And then what's really interesting is in the case of adult beverage, even though very few adult beverages saw a price increase, when there was one, it tended to be a pretty hefty one and probably noticeable.
Yeah, that's a huge multiple.
It's a big multiple. So I would actually like to ask in chat what you all think. What do you think is, for the most part, the smarter play? Is it better to raise prices across the entire menu by a small amount? Or is it better to raise prices of just a few items by a larger amount? I think there is no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious of the diversity of votes. So I guess if you're chatting in vote, you could just say, small amount or large amount, maybe is the shorthand for how to vote.
Just to the naked eye, it looks like a majority are saying the entire menu by a small amount.
Entire menu by a small amount. Okay, which is interesting because that's actually not what we've done as an industry. And who knows, maybe it's a lot smarter, maybe it's a little bit smarter, maybe it's not smarter, but interesting that the way we're thinking about things in this webinar is different than the way restaurants as a whole have actually gone about things. So let's look at this one other way, which is by price point. So if you look at items that are between $1 and $2.50 versus $2.50 to $5, $5 to $10, etc. Same thing. How much did those prices tend to increase overall? what percentage of those items underwent a price increase, and how much of a price change should we see when those prices were adjusted. So this is a little bit more of a tactical nuance, but the percentage price change tends to be highest in lower priced items. And I think that's really just a human condition where operators are saying, yeah, if I'm going to adjust it, I'm going to adjust it by $1 or 50 cents or some, reasonable number. No one's doing like a 20-cent price increase, right? There's probably some sort of minimum increment for which it makes any sense, which is why you're seeing that effect of it being an outsized impact on lower priced items. You also see that really expensive menu items, $30 and up and $40 and up items, those are less likely to have seen a price increase. I think at some point, even if it's, filet mignon or something that's, expensive already, operators saying, you know what, I just don't think I can charge much more than I've already been charging for this, right? Taking another 20% on a $50 dish is just going to be way too big for my customers to stomach. So you're getting a little bit of a polarizing effect there.
Yeah, and I'm looking at from the $5 price point all the way up to $20. I mean, there's your limited service restaurant entrees.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's a question for y'all. Which menu item, what type of thing might you find on the menu that saw the largest single price increase over the last year? And you have a clue, which is good philosophy to go by, which is that whimsical ideas, they never go stale. Which menu item saw the largest price increase over the last year? Are we getting any good guesses?
Yeah, people are starting to get it. I think people caught on to the clue.
And there you go. Wings up 10.3%, which is one of the, this is overall, right? Across all wings on menus, they're about 10% more expensive today than they were roughly a year ago. And 56% of all wings have taken a menu price increase. And if you do just sort of that back of the envelope math, that means about, for the wings that did go up in price, they went up in price about 20%. So it's been quite significant. And you can see by menu category, these are the ones that, sort of went up heavily in price versus some examples of things that didn't go up in price nearly as much. So wine, beer, bottled alcohol, cocktails, all that stuff stayed pretty stable. But boy, if you look at the left, it's like all the protein stuff, right? Wings, beef entrees, pork entrees, sandwiches that often have, a featured protein, for instance. That's where we've had the biggest impact.
Yeah,
So,
Jack, people are asking if that's for bone-in wings only. I think it might be, just because that's usually what drives the price of the bird.
oh, well, so we're looking at our wings category inside of Menu Friends, which would include boneless wings too, but we could actually do that analysis outside of this webinar and look at bone-in versus boneless and see where that's been. But that's actually a good observation. You're probably right. If we broke it up, maybe it's even more extreme for bone-in and not quite as extreme for boneless.
Yeah, a chicken can only have 2 wings.
That is true. That was wasn't that like a TV spot a while ago? Like I've never seen a chicken like this one before. Anyways, so some things that we've learned. 1, menu inflation slightly lags general CPI. 2, this is going to put significant pressure on operator margins if their costs are up, their labor costs are up, their rent might be up as well, but they're not able to pass along the full cost of that to the consumer. Price increases have historically been larger in limited service restaurants. I think that is a trend that will probably continue to persist for a little bit. Price increases have tended to be targeted. They're not across the menu. They tend to be for specific items, and it's often driven by items where there are higher costs for the operator. It seems like the operator mindset is not like, hey, ooh, this is an opportunity for me to charge more and make more money from customers. It's more like, boy, how do I keep my costs in check and not pass along too much to the customer that it drives away my business? 40% of all menu items increase in price, and those that didn't increase in price jumped a whopping 15.2% in price, something that consumers will definitely notice. Price increases higher among entrees, lower among check builders because you don't want to scare people away from buying a dessert or a beverage. And operators tend to be reacting to their own higher food costs, and protein is a particular pain point. And the question is, how do you sort of beat this inflationary monster? And I'll go back to something we've shown a few times in the past, which is if you look at all the menu item and LTO activity at chain restaurants over the past 15, 16 years, this is the percentage of all new items on a monthly basis at chain restaurants that are combo meals and value items, basically deal promotions of some sort. The number hit a high of 37%, which is crazy, crazy high as a follow-on to the financial crisis. We've not done that during COVID. We've not even done that during the beginning of this inflationary pressure that we're experiencing right now. Like that pink line is not jumping up recently, but I think you will see is it's going to start ticking up a little bit now that most people are convinced that inflation is here to stay and restaurants are going to react to that in some way. You know, and look, it's totally fine for us to have some more deal-based stuff. I'm not saying that we don't want that line to go up at all. It's okay for that to be part of your strategy. We want to be careful that we don't overdose on deal promos and that doesn't become your entire strategy. We've gone through this before as an industry, and the aftermath of it was quite painful. We don't want food to turn into clothes where we train consumers to only buy stuff that's on sale. That is really, 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 really quite bad. And you know, some brands end up with something like a barbell menu, which may have worked for some, didn't work well for others, where you had a lot of activity for premium items and you had a lot of activity for like the really, really cheap deal items and not much purchase activity for the middle of the menu. If you can make that work, great, but most brands probably can't make that strategy work. So if you can do deal promos, think about them as a chance to innovate at the same time and be creative with them, and don't let your brand become a place that's just about getting a better value. This is one of my favorite charts that we've shown in the past before, which is what are the foods that people most want to get away from home versus the things that people most say, if I'm going to have it, I just want to get it from my house instead. I don't need a restaurant for this. So the top out of, you know, thousands of different foods, what do people think, things that people say, I want to get this from a restaurant. And the bottom are, you know, among those thousands, what's like on the opposite end of that spectrum. If you look at the things at the top, I mean, you start noticing some things right away, which is a lot of these are things that people just don't know how to make at home and tend to feature flavors and themes from around the world, you know, instead. It's not PB&J, it's wontons and sushi and mushu pork and calzones and pad thai, etc. And even if you ask people, hey, think about like cuisines. Like, would you rather have that cuisine from a restaurant or someplace away from home, or would you rather get it from your home? There's only one cuisine, if you can call it that, in this country that people say, I'd rather have that at home than at a restaurant. And that's American food. For everything else, people would rather get that thing from a restaurant or away from home someplace. And that is basically our secret to getting people to continue to engage with restaurants, even in the wake of inflation and budgetary pressure. Give them something to be excited about. And the thing to make them excited is stuff they can't just normally get from food, from home. It's like all this other stuff. We even see this if we think about like our max stage, right? Inception level stuff is stuff that's really progressive. Ubiquity stuff is stuff that's basically everywhere. If it's inception level ingredients, like some new taste, people want that away from home. If it's something that's really, really common, people don't really care so much anymore if they get it from home or away from home. We should focus on innovation if we want to keep things going. So our message to you is don't stop innovating. You can do some value stuff. Wonderful, that's great. But do not let that be a substitute for innovation. It's really important that we not put ourselves into some sort of a hole that's really hard to dig out of. And innovation will actually keep you ahead of most of your competitors. So with that, I think, oh my God, I actually didn't look at the clock until now, and the timing worked out great. So we'll be back in 2 weeks talking about the foundations of eating and the behaviors of the modern diner. We'll have some guest presenters as well. April 14th in 2 weeks, noon Central. Thank you all again for joining in. If you have questions about this data or anything else, please reach out to your Datassential contact. We'd love to have that conversation. And if for some strange reason you're not working with us yet, just email us at hello@datassential.com, and we'd love to start a relationship with you. Thank you, everyone.